Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So continuing with our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri. In this lesson we are going to be looking at three sections from the book. The first will be related to things that nullify the prayer. The second will be the missed prayers, and finally we'll end with a discussion on some of the disliked times for prayers, and perhaps some of the Nawafil prayers, if we have time for that. So we are going to start with building on prayer and what invalidates it. Imam al-Quduri begins by stating, فَإِنْ سَبَقَهُ الْحَدَث إِنْ صَرَفَ وَتَوَضَّعَ وَبَنَى عَلَى صَلَاتِهِ إِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ إِمَامًا. If someone who is not the Imam is overcome by minor ritual impurity, namely within his prayer, he leaves the prayer, performs wudu, and then he builds and completes his prayer. And so this is known as bina, or building on one's prayer. And the basis is that from a qiyasi perspective, from the perspective of analogy, over here on your right, this would be deemed to be invalid. Right? This would be deemed to be invalid. And why would it be invalid? The reason it is invalid is because the tahrima ceases to remain with a state of ritual impurity, just like it cannot be initiated in such a state. So you cannot initiate your tahrima, the act that enters you into prayer, when you are in a state of ritual impurity, when you do not have wudu, or when you do not have ghusl when you need it. And so if you cannot commence the prayer in that state, then you should not be able to continue the prayer in that state either. And so the eligibility to pray is lacking in that individual who is not in a state of ritual purity. And so we have this principle that something subsisting alongside that which negates it is considered impossible. Right? Something subsisting alongside that which negates it is considered impossible. And so the tahrima cannot exist alongside a state of ritual impurity, because a state of ritual impurity negates the tahrima. And when we speak about the tahrima, remember, tahrima in its linguistic meaning, it means to render something haram, to render something inviolable or sacred. And so when we say Allahu Akbar, this is the tahrima, and what that does is, through that we enter into a state of prayer, and now there are various actions that become impermissible for us, such as eating and drinking and talking in normal everyday speech, and so on and so forth. But the tahrima can only be maintained when one is in a state of ritual impurity. So analogy would dictate that if you do break your wudu in prayer, that your prayer will be invalidated and you would have to restart again. But the Hanafis over here, the reason why they deemed it valid to build on one's prayer in this specific scenario is based on this concept that we took in the last class, which was istihsan. And so we took this in the previous class as well, which was that we have this notion of istihsan. And what is istihsan? Istihsan is essentially, where is it? Is basically something that is contrary to the prevalent logic of the law. And so the analogy is the prevalent logic of the law. Analogy shows us that this is what the logical conclusion on this issue should be, based on what we know of the broader principles and the broader ahkam within our tradition. But istihsan, what you're doing is you're going against that prevalent logic because of a specific reason, because of a text, because of need, necessity, because of custom. There are various sources upon which istihsan is based. So over here, in our case, what is the istihsan based upon? The istihsan is based upon this prophetic hadith that is related in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and Imam Muhammad also relates it in his Muwatta, where the Prophet ﷺ kabbara fi salatin min as-salawat, that he gave takbir for a prayer, for one of the prayers amongst the prayers that he would perform. ثم أشار إليهم بيده, then he basically gestured to the congregation with his hand, and he told them to remain. Right? He said remain. He then left. فانطلق رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم رجع وعلى جلده أثر فصلى. He then left and returned, and there were traces of ablution on his, basically on his skin, on his body. And then he prayed. And so Imam Muhammad over here, when he relates this hadith in the Muwatta from Imam Malik, he says, وَبِهَذَا نَأْخُذْ, that this is the opinion that we take, that whoever in prayer is affected by ritual impurity, then there is no harm in him leaving the prayer without speaking, performing wudu, and then building upon his prayer and completing it from where he left. And so this became the Hanafi rule, because there was an explicit prophetic hadith on this issue that allowed them to go against the prevalent logic of the law, or what qiyas dictated. And Imam Muhammad in Al-Hujjah, he narrates another hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. He says from Aisha radiallahu anha, that the Prophet ﷺ said, if any one of you vomits in his prayer or has a nosebleed, ra'afa, then let him leave and perform ablution. فَلْيَنْصَرِفْ فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ. Right? And then complete whatever remains of his prayer, so long as he does not speak. مَا لَمْ يَتَكَلَّمْ. And this is related by Imam Muhammad in Al-Hujjah ala Ahl al-Madinah. And Imam Muhammad relates from several companions this same idea. He relates it from Sayyidina Umar, from Salman al-Farisi, from Ibn Umar, from Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, from Sha'abi, and various other authorities, early authorities in the Muslim community, from the Sahaba and from the Tabi'een. And so we took again that the Hanafis were individuals who had a theory of the legal community where they gave preference to the fuqaha from amongst the Salaf. And over here, people like Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Ibn al-Musayyib, and Sayyidina Umar were of course considered the top tier of the fuqaha from the companions and from the tabi'een respectively. And so this is why, considering all this evidence, the Hanafi said that this idea of building on the prayer that one has performed an act in which negated his ablution, his wudu, should be permitted, contrary to what analogy dictates. Then Imam al-Quduri continues, وَإِنْ كَانَ إِمَامًا إِسْتَخْلَفَ وَتَوَضَّأَ وَبَنَى عَلَى صَلَاتِهِ مَا لَمْ يَتَكَلَّمْ وَالْإِسْتِعْنَافُ أَفْضَلُ. If he is the Imam, he appoints a replacement, performs the wudu, completes his prayer, so long as he does not speak. And again, this is what the this is along the same lines as the wording of the hadith that we just took. Restarting the prayer, though, is better. وَالْإِسْتِعْنَافُ أَفْضَلُ. The reason why isti'naf is preferable is because it is better to avoid the khilaf on this issue, because there were ulama who did not permit this act of building on the prayer. And so, generally speaking, it is considered mustahab or recommended to get out of the khilaf between the ulama, to perform one's ibadah in a way where one's action is not considered invalid or severely disliked in another madhab. And that's, of course, so long as it is not something that is disliked or impermissible in one's own school. So over here, there's no obligation for an individual to build on his prayer. He has the choice to do it. And so because it's simply a choice that he has, the Hanafi fuqaha mentioned that it is better to simply restart the prayer to avoid khilaf with those of other madhahib like the Shafi'is. And Imam Muhammad himself says this in the Muwatta when he says, وأفضل ذلك أن يتكلم ويتوضأ ويستقبل صلاته وهو قول أبي حنيفة. That it is better for him to actually just engage in normal behavior, do wudu, and then restart his prayer. And this is the position of Abu Hanifa. So now we get into this idea of not speaking, which is mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and the way Imam al-Quduri presents the ruling as well. And we took this idea last class as well, which is that istihsan, especially when it's based on a text, especially when it is something contrary to the prevalent logic of the law, contrary to qiyas, and based on a specific nas from the Prophet ﷺ and the early Muslims, then in this case, the allowance or the exception that's granted to people is very restrictive. And it is restricted, this istihsan is restricted to the specific terms that are mentioned in the tradition that have come regarding it. So what you have is you have the qiyas, then you have a text that overturns this qiyasi ruling, that presents an exception to the ruling that should be affirmed by way of analogy. So the Hanafis will accept this hadith and accept this exception, but they will restrict the exception to the specific terms of that hadith. And so what are these conditions, or what are the terms that this hadith is coming with, or these traditions that we've taken? That firstly, we'll mention 5 over here. There are actually about 12, but we'll just mention 5 so people don't get confused, and because some of them are not immediately relevant in this particular context. Firstly, you can only build on a prayer in which you have committed an act that has made you enter into a state of ritual impurity, and this state of ritual impurity should have been something that overcomes one and not something that is done intentionally. It is not something that you do intentionally. It's something that simply overcomes you, and you had sort of no control over it. And this is indicated by the words of the Prophet, in sabaqaha, or sabaqahu, that if this is something that overcomes one. And so if you do, if you pass wind intentionally in prayer, then you cannot build on that prayer, right? It has to be something that overcomes one and something that one did not have control over. The second condition is that it should not be a form of ritual impurity that requires ghusl, right? It should not be a form of ritual impurity that requires ghusl. Why? And if you see over here, the reason I've highlighted some of these points is because if you go back to the hadith, I've actually highlighted some of the words from where these conditions come from. So this first condition of ritual impurity that overcomes one, because the Prophet, what did he specify? He specified vomiting, and he specified a nosebleed. So these are usually things, when you're in prayer, usually when we're talking about vomiting, it's something that's overcome you. You're not actually sticking your fingers in your mouth to vomit. And similarly, a nosebleed is something that just happens. You don't really have control over it. And so these two words in this hadith, the Hanafis said, okay, we're only going to restrict this exception to ritual impurity that overcomes one, not something that one does intentionally. Then the second one, not one requiring ghusl. And again over here, looking at the red, why? Because the Prophet only identified actions that were those that broke one's wudu. They were not ones that broke one's ghusl. And secondly, what did he say? He said, do wudu, over here in the green. Right? He said, perform wudu. There was no mention of perform wudu or ghusl. And so the Hanafi said it can only apply to those actions that require wudu not those that require ghusl. And of course, another thing that fuqaha mentioned in this context is that ghusl simply requires, it requires unclothing and being naked and so on and so forth. And so that's more of a contravention of the prayer than simply doing wudu, which is, just washing the forearms and the head and the face and so on and so forth. The third condition is that it is not something that is rare, such as unconsciousness. And again, this returns to the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, the terms that he mentioned in the tradition apply to your normal nullifiers of wudu. The fourth is that you must leave immediately or before the time it takes to perform a rukn, which is generally estimated as the time it takes you to say Subhanallah 3 times. And why do you have to leave immediately? So we have blue over here. Why? Because the Prophet commanded that when one of you nullifies his wudu in this particular manner in his prayer, then what do? Leave. Right? Then you leave. You do not simply tarry in your prayer. You do not remain in your prayer and say, okay, I'm going to complete this sajda or this ruku, and then I'll go and redo wudu and build on my prayer. One of the reasons for this is because what you're doing effectively now, if you don't immediately leave your prayer, what you are effectively doing is you're continuing to pray in a state of ritual impurity. And that will definitely invalidate your prayer. That's how some of the ulama reasoned in regard to that. And then fifthly, the fifth condition is that in the process of leaving and performing wudu and returning back to pray, you do not engage in an action that is considered unnecessary and would otherwise invalidate your prayer. And this is purple over here. So the hadith, what does the hadith say? مَا لَمْ يَتَكَلَّمْ, so long as he does not speak. And over here the Hanafis understood this as so long as he does not engage in actions that are unnecessary and foreign to the prayer. Okay, so if one engages in dhikr, for example, that's fine, because dhikr is part of the prayer. If one engages in turning on the tap, that is fine. Why? Because that is necessary. You need to turn on the tap in order to perform wudu. Similarly, the ulama in the past, they would mention grabbing a bucket, putting it down the well. These are all actions which in this context are necessary. In normal context, they are considered foreign to the prayer, but in this context, you cannot attain water except through these actions, and so you are permitted to perform some of these actions. But any action that is foreign to the prayer and not necessary, that will invalidate your prayer if you engage in them in this specific context. So these are 5 conditions that the Hanafis took from the hadith. And you can see again over here, the istihsan is very restrictive. And it is restrictive because it is contrary to analogy. And so the Hanafi said we are only going to grant an exception to what the hadith has specifically come regarding. And anything beyond that will remain on the original qiyas. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions وَإِنْ نَامَ فَاحْتَلَمَ أَوْ جُنَّ أَوْ أُغْمِيَ عَلَيْهِ أَوْ قَحْقَحَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ اسْتَأْنَفَ الْوُضُوء وَالصَّلَاةَ جَمِيعًا. If he falls asleep and ejaculates or loses sanity or becomes unconscious or laughs in prayer, he performs ablution and prayer again. And again, these return to the points mentioned earlier. If he ejaculates, why? Because point number 2, it requires ghusl. If he loses sanity or becomes unconscious, why? Because of point number 3, these are rare occurrences. And also, one can say this also applies to point number 4 as well. Why does it apply to point number 4? If you fall unconscious, I mean, it's a bizarre scenario, falling unconscious in prayer. Then you are unable to leave immediately from the prayer in order to build on it. The same is usually the case with insanity. Laughing out loud in prayer, there are again 2 reasons mentioned for this. One is because, again, it is rare. So condition number 3. Many ulama, however, also say that it is actually number 5. Kahkaha, or laughing out loud, is they almost treat it as a form of speech in prayer, right? It is a form of speech within prayer, and something foreign to the prayer, and so it will negate the prayer in that manner. And so it is not from the from those things that nullify your wudu unintentionally, right? It is something you engage in intentionally. And so this is how the ulama understand laughing. So all of these things that we've mentioned over here, they can relate to, depending on how you understand them and rationalize them, they can relate to multiple, they can be seen as contraventions of multiple conditions over here that we've mentioned, these five. And different fuqaha give different reasons for why some of these actions do not allow one to build and complete his prayer if they occur within the prayer itself. It's good to see the different angles from which the ulama are reasoning. So the idea that ighma, or becoming unconscious, is uncommon is one idea, and that's good. But it also makes sense that, oh yes, this actually, when you're unconscious in prayer, when you feel unconscious in prayer, you are unable to leave immediately from the prayer, and so you're effectively in the prayer in a state of unconsciousness, and this will invalidate the prayer and prevent building upon it. Similarly, understanding laughing out loud as a form of speech, right, that is not your normal nullifier of wudu, right, that is not deemed as something that simply overcomes one, and so forth. This is also a line of reasoning that is interesting and needs to be kept in mind. And so there are multiple ways one can frame these issues. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions, وَإِن تَكَلَّمَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ عَامِدًا أَوْ سَاهِيًا بَطَلَتْ صَلَاتُهُ. If he speaks in prayer intentionally or unintentionally, his prayer is invalidated. And this is pretty straightforward and pretty clear to all of us. And again, if we frame laughing out loud as a form of speech, then we understand also why one cannot build on that prayer in which one laughed out loud. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions, وَإِن سَبَقَهُ الحدث بعدما قعد قدر التشهد توضع وسلم. If minor ritual impurity overcomes him after he has sat for the extent of the tashahhud, he performs ablution and then the taslim. Why? Over here, we've taken in previous classes that sitting, the final sitting for the extent of the tashahhud, is considered an obligation in prayer. It is considered one of the arkan of the prayer. And then saying the taslim, saying as-salam, is considered wajib. And so over here, if one of these actions that allows you to build on your prayer, if it occurs after you have sat for the extent of the tashahhud, you should still perform ablution and then give the taslim. Why? Because the taslim is considered wajib. Right? If you do not do this, then your prayer will still be valid, but it will be extremely deficient because you have missed out on a wajib. Okay, but you have fulfilled the final rukn of prayer, and so technically your prayer is considered valid, but because you've missed out on a wajib action, it is considered or deemed extremely deficient. Then Imam al-Quduri says, وَإِن تَعَمَّدَ الْحَدَث في هذه الحالة أو تكلم أو عمل عملا ينافي الصلاة تمت صلاته. If he intentionally nullifies his ablution in this context, and what he means by in this context is after having sat for the extent of the tashahhud. So this is a continuation of the previous ruling. Or speaks or engages in an action that invalidates his prayer is considered complete. Why? This returns to the point that I mentioned, which is that you have fulfilled the last rukn or the last obligation of prayer. And so now if you do something that invalidates your prayer, then you would simply be seen as someone who has exited the prayer after having completed all of its obligatory actions. Of course, this would be considered extremely and severely disliked, because you've left out a wajib, but in this case, the prayer will be deemed complete. Right? The prayer will be deemed complete, and you cannot build on it in order to perform the taslim, in order to perform the final taslim. Why? Because now the actions you are committing are those that do not allow you to build upon your prayer, right? Which are invalidating your prayer intentionally, speaking, doing some amal that would otherwise invalidate your prayer, and so on and so forth. So in this case, you cannot build on your prayer and give the taslim, but your prayer is considered complete because you have fulfilled the last of the arkan of the prayer. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions, وَإِنْ رَأَى الْمُتَيَمِّمُ الْمَاءَ فِي صَلَاتِهِ بَطَلَتْ صَلَاتُهُ. If the person who performed tayammum sees water in his prayer is invalidated. Why? Because tayammum is permitted based on an excuse, and that excuse is the inability to use water, either actually or effectively. So actually meaning water is not present, you're in a desert and there's no water around you. And effectively meaning water is present, but you are unable to because, you might be bedridden, you might be too ill, you might not have the tools to extract water, and so on and so forth. And so seeing over here, when the ulama mentioned in ra'a, seeing over here means basically having the ability to use water for ablution. And so a person who is sick, who is unable to perform wudu, in this case, his seeing water being around him does not nullify his tayammum, right? Because the excuse for him is his inability to use water due to his sickness. And so that's how we understand ra'a over here, which means simply the ability to use water. And furthermore, the fuqaha will mention various conditions over here as well, such as if you are someone who did tayammum because of a lack of access to water, and then you come across water, that will only invalidate your tayammum if it is an amount that allows you to perform a minimal valid wudu. If it's a small amount of water, with which you can only wash your hands and your arms and nothing else, then that is not considered something to have invalidated your tayammum. So over here, a person who's in prayer, who sees water, and he sees an amount that would allow him to do wudu, and he possesses the ability to do wudu, and so on and so forth, then his prayer will be invalidated. Then over here we have this interesting case, 12 cases over here, which we'll read. وَإِنْ رَآهُ بَعْدَمَا قَعَدَ قَدْرَ التَّشَهُدِ. And if he sees water after having sat for the extent of the tashahhud, أو كان ماسحا على الخفين فانقضت مدة مسحه, or he was someone who wiped over his khufs and the time period elapsed, أو خلع خفيه بعمل رفيق, or he removed his khufs with slight actions, أو كان أميا فتعلم سورة, or he was illiterate and learned a surah, meaning by surah over here they mean what he minimally requires to make his prayer valid, which would be effectively one verse of the Quran according to Abu Hanifa. O Uryanan فوجد ثوبا, he was naked and found a garment. Again, any cloth that could cover his minimal nakedness. O Mumiyan فقدر على ركوع وسجود, he was someone praying with head movements and then gained the ability to bow and prostrate. O تذكر أن عليه صلاة قبل هذه الصلاة, he remembered he had to perform a prayer, a make-up prayer before the current one. أو أحدث الإمام القارئ فاستخلف أميا, or he was an imam able to recite who nullified his ablution and chose someone mute as a replacement. أو طلعت الشمس في صلاة الفجر, or the sun rose while performing Fajr, أو دخل وقت العصر وهو في الجمعة, or the time of Asr entered while he was praying Jum'ah, أو كان ماسحا على الجبيرة فسقطت عن برء, or he had wiped on a bandage and it fell off when he had been healed, meaning the bandage fell off and his skin underneath was healed. And finally, أو كان صاحب عذر فانقطع عذره كالمستحاضة ومن بمعناها, or he was someone who is صاحب العذر, someone with an excuse, and the excuse ceased. And we took what the صاحب العذر was in the previous lesson. So these are 12 scenarios. In all these scenarios, what happens? بطلت صلاته في هذه الحالات كلها في قول أبي حنيفة. In all these scenarios, his prayer is invalidated with Abu Hanifa. All 12 of these scenarios, specifically this issue is about these 12 scenarios occurring after you have sat to the extent of the tashahhud in your final sitting. Okay, so all these 12 scenarios are, you're in your final rak'ah, you rise up from your second sajda, you sit for the extent of the tashahhud, and then one of these 12 things happen. What is the ruling? Abu Hanifa says, your prayer is invalidated. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad say, your prayer is complete. قال أبو يوسف ومحمد تمت صلاته في هذه المسائل كلها. Now what's going on over here? Why is this khilaf? And the reason why this discussion becomes important is because, well, Salman, you just said a few moments ago that sitting for the extent of the tashahhud is considered the last of the arkan of prayer. So why would these 12 things happening after that final sitting, why would they invalidate the prayer with Abu Hanifa? And so over here we actually have a khilaf. These are referred to as the 12 issues. And we have a khilaf on what the reasoning of Abu Hanifa was. So Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i, who is the teacher of Abu Hasan al-Karhi, and a contemporary of Imam al-Tahawi, what he mentioned was that according to Abu Hanifa, exiting the prayer of one's own volition, of one's own action, is obligatory. Right? So this is a extra obligation that we have now added. That according to Abu Hanifa, exiting the prayer of one's own volition, right, bisun'ihi, is obligatory in the prayer. Why is that? Because what Abu Hanifa said was that if you have entered prayer, there needs to be a way to exit prayer, right? You have entered prayer, now you have to exit the prayer in some way or the other. Simply sitting for the extent of the tashahhud, you sit for the extent of the tashahhud, that's quote unquote your final rukn of the prayer, but it is not as if when you sit for the extent of the tashahhud, you automatically exit the prayer once you've sat for that extent. Which is why you can still do dua, you can still do salawat in the Prophet ﷺ, you can still say, Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasana, and then you do the taslim. And so it shows you that just because you've said the tashahhud or sat for the extent of the tashahhud does not mean that you've just exited your prayer. There needs to be an actual exiting of the prayer in order for you to move on to the next prayer, or in order for you to now say that I have removed myself from the tahrima, from the state that I put myself in at the beginning. So this is why Abu Hanifa said that the individual praying, what he needs to do is, of his own volition, of his own action, he needs to decide that I've now exited the prayer. And Abu Hanifa deemed this to be an obligation. And in a way, this is very similar to the reasoning that the Imams used for the obligation of the final sitting itself, right? Which we took in a few classes earlier, which was the idea that it related to the same idea, that there needs to be some form of an ending to the prayer. Because the prayer has a beginning, so it has to have some form of an ending. It has to have some mode of an ending. And the final sitting is the one that we see in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And on top of that, Abu Hanifa extended this reasoning and said, okay, but then we also need an actual act of exiting the prayer. And over here, Abu Hanifa said that thus it becomes obligatory, fard, on the individual to exit the prayer of his own volition. And all 12 of these scenarios, he is not exiting the prayer of his own volition, of his own action, right? When he sees, if we take these scenarios, if he sees water, if he's someone in a state of tayammum and he sees water after having sat the extent of the tashahhud, his prayer has been quote unquote ended, not because he has chosen to exit the prayer, but because there's this external reality that has become clear to him, which is that, oh, there's water over here, and now that water, what it does is the presence of that water and the ability to use that water nullifies his wudu, and so forces him to exit out of the prayer. So he's not done it of his own volition. He is not actually sat for the extent of the tashahhud and then said, okay, I'm done. Rather, he's been made to exit the prayer. Similarly, someone who's wiping over khufs and the time period elapses. Again, the dispensation to wipe over khufs is specified by a particular time limit. And so when that time limit ends, then your dispensation ends with it. And so over here, when the time period elapses, you return back to your previous state of hadath, or ritual impurity, as it relates to your feet at least, and that will invalidate your prayer. You had nothing to do with that invalidation. Okay? If we take the example of someone who was someone who's praying with head movements and then gained the ability to bow and prostrate. The basis is that if you have the ability to bow and prostrate, your prayer with head movements is not valid. And this regaining of the ability after sitting the extent of the final tashahhud, this is something that simply comes over you. Suddenly you're like, oh, I can actually bow and prostrate now. That back pain that was preventing me from bowing and prostrate has just disappeared after I've sat for this extent. And so you're not exiting the prayer of your own volition, of your own action. Rather, it is something that has sort of come over you and placed you in a state where your prayer is now deemed to have been invalidated. And that ending or invalidation of the prayer is not because of your own volition, of your own choice. And so all of these scenarios are similar in that regard. And so Abu Hanifa says that this obligation is not being fulfilled in this particular case. Abu Hasan al-Karhi had a different reasoning. There's actually a difference of opinion between the ulama whether we include this as one of the obligations in prayer, namely exiting the prayer of your own volition. But Abu Hasan al-Karhi, what he said was, well, these are things that invalidate the prayer at the beginning. These things invalidate the prayer at its beginning, and therefore they will also invalidate the prayer at its end. And so it's a similar idea. It's this return to qiyas that we took, which is the idea that you cannot engage in a tahrima alongside that which will negate it. And similarly, your prayer cannot continue, that state that you've entered yourself into cannot continue with something that negates your tahrima. And so, if we take the example of this tayammum example, if you have access to water at the beginning of your prayer, it is not permitted for you to initiate that prayer. Right? You cannot simply do tayammum and initiate that prayer. That's not considered valid. That is something that, or if you said Allahu Akbar, You entered prayer and then you saw, oh, there's water right next to me. I didn't realize it and I just performed tayammum. Your prayer is invalidated. And so if it's invalidated at that point, Imam al-Karhi says, it should also hold that it invalidates your prayer at the very end as well. And you can see that with all these other scenarios as well. You wipe over your khufs, you start praying, you realize that, oh, actually my time period had elapsed. Your initiation or commencement is not sound. Or you start reciting the Fatiha and then your time period elapses. Again, your prayer is considered invalidated. And so if it's invalid at the beginning due to these reasons, it is also invalid at the end due to these reasons. And most of these reasons do not allow for building on the prayer because they do not fulfill the 5 conditions that we mentioned. So that's the difference in the reasoning between Al-Barda'i and Al-Karhi when it comes to explaining the view of Abu Hanifa on these issues. For Muhammad and Abu Yusuf, they say the prayer is complete. Why? Because, again, returning to that point, that, well, the final rukn has been completed, which is sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. The rukn has been completed. And so, if you invalidate the prayer after that point, then you're missing a wajib in terms of the taslim, but you fulfilled all the arkan of your salah, and so your prayer will be considered complete. Now we move on to, so that's the section on building on your prayers and things that invalidate it. F, which is the imam appointing someone to replace him if he breaks his wudu in salah. We have not taken the details of that. That's also a point of dispute, but inshallah in a future course we'll take the details of that. So now we're up to make-up prayers. So let me see how. Yeah. So Imam al-Quduri mentions وَمَنْ فَاتَتْهُ صَلَاةٌ قَضَاهَا إِذَا ذَكَرَهَا. Whoever misses a prayer makes it up when he remembers. This is effectively a point of ijma' or scholarly consensus. There were a few ulama, I believe like Ibn Hazm and others, who disagreed, but the overwhelming majority of the ulama and the near consensus position of the ulama is that the make-up prayers the missed prayers have to be made up. And there are various texts regarding this. We know the Prophet ﷺ said, if one of you sleeps through his prayer, then let him make it up when he remembers. The Quranic command is also, when the Quran commands the prayer, what the Quran does is it commands you to pray and it commands you to pray in a specific time. And so just because you are unable to pray in a specific time does not mean the command to pray is lifted from you. Okay, that's another argument that the ulama make. But this is a fairly, even though there's some confusion about this in certain circles of modern scholarship, in the classical madhahib, this is basically a point of scholarly consensus that when you miss a prayer, you have to make up that prayer. And we won't get into the detailed arguments regarding that. وقدمها لزوما على صلاة الوقت إلا أن يخاف فوت صلاة الوقت فيقدم صلاة الوقت على صلاة الفائتة ثم يقضيها. It is obligatory to perform the makeup before the current prayer unless one fears missing the latter. In this case, one prays the current prayer before the missed prayer and then makes up the latter. We've taken this idea before in one of the very first lessons in this book, which was that Abu Hanifa has a principle that order must be observed between obligatory prayers unless there is an excuse. Tartib must be observed between obligatory prayers. And so Imam al-Quduri has this really nice way of explaining this issue. He says, الترتيب مع بقاء الوقت واجب بالوقت والفعل. That when we talk about the obligation of maintaining order, right, then this obligation relates to both a time and an act. Right? It relates to both a time and an act. What does this mean? It means the reason why we pray Dhuhr before Asr is because the time of Dhuhr is before the time of Asr. And so naturally, Dhuhr precedes Asr in terms of its performance. Right? But then we see situations in the practice of the Prophet ﷺ where the time ceases to remain, يسقط الوقت, such as Yom Arafah, during the Hajj season, but still you are not allowed to simply switch the order. Right? You are not allowed to simply switch the order. So at Yom Arafah during the Hajj season, you pray Dhuhr and Asr together in the same time. Okay? But that does not allow you, just because the time has ceased to be, that does not allow you to pray Asr before Dhuhr. Right? And so Imam al-Quduri says, what does this indicate? فَدَلَّ على أن الترتيب يجب بالوقت والفعل فإذا فات الوقت سقط الترتيب بالوقت وبقي ترتيب الفعل. That what this indicates is that the order, the obligation to maintain order is necessary due to the issue of time and due to the issue of the action that you're performing. So when the time drops, the obligation to observe order is still present in terms of the act itself. And what does that mean? That means the act of performing Dhuhr must precede the act of performing Asr. Usually that is associated with time, right? Usually we can say the act of performing Dhuhr must precede the act of performing Asr because the time of Dhuhr is before the time of Asr. But when you miss Dhuhr prayer, the first clause, the act of performing Dhuhr must precede the act of performing Asr. That is still there. That still applies. And so this is what we mean by this idea of order being maintained, and this is how Imam al-Quduri explains it in his commentary on Mukhtasar of Imam al-Karhi. And one of the, beyond Yom Arafah, one of the evidences that the Hanafis use for this is also this prophetic report in the Sunan of Imam al-Nasa'i, where the Prophet ﷺ and his companions missed some prayers. فأمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بلالا فأقام لصلاة الظهر فصلاها كما كان يصليها لوقتها ثم أقام للعصر فصلاها كما كان يصليها في وقتها ثم أذن المغرب إلى آخره. So the Prophet, what he did was, when he missed these prayers, him and his companions, he ordered Bilal and told him, give the Iqamah for Dhuhr prayer, and then they performed the Dhuhr prayer as they would have performed it in its time. Then he gave the Iqamah for Asr and performed it as he would have said, as he would have in its time, and then the Iqamah for Maghrib, and he did likewise with Maghrib. And so the Prophet ﷺ maintained order between these prayers. Right? He maintained order between these prayers, even though the time for some of these prayers had ceased to remain because they had been missed. But nonetheless, because the act of Dhuhr precedes the act of Asr, and the act of Asr precedes the act of Maghrib, the Prophet ﷺ still maintained this order. And so this forms the basis for this topic governing principle, that order must be observed between obligatory prayers unless there's an excuse. And over here, we go back to this point. Some of you may have been thinking for these 12 issues. Point number 7, أو تذكر أن عليه صلاة قبل هذه الصلاة. He remembered that he had to perform a prayer before the current one. Right? Because you cannot perform a current prayer when you have an earlier prayer to perform, and the obligation to maintain order between the two is present or applies. So that should explain that particular issue. This was the practice of the Prophet ﷺ. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions وإن فاتته صلوات رتبها في القضاء كما وجبت في الأصل إلا أن تزيد الفوائد على 6 صلوات فيسقط الترتيب فيها. If he misses prayer, he prays them in order when making them up, as we saw with the example of the Prophet ﷺ. He prays them in order when making them up in the way they were originally obligatory. So Dhuhr before Asr, Asr before Maghrib, Maghrib before Isha, and Isha before Fajr. Unless the number of makeups exceeds 6, in which case the obligation to observe order drops. And so this is an excuse. There are 3 basic excuses that render this obligation to observe order, render them non-binding. The first is that you would miss the current prayer. So an example, you miss Dhuhr, Asr time came in, you slept through right through Dhuhr, right through Asr. You wake up with like a few minutes left for Asr prayer. You have to quickly do wudu, and assuming that this Dhuhr prayer, let's say it's the first prayer you ever missed. Now over here, the default ruling is that you should perform Dhuhr first, then you perform Asr, based on the topic governing principle that we took. But in this particular case, because you only have a few minutes left, you know that if I perform Dhuhr, then I will miss my Asr. Current prayer takes precedence, right? Because your qada is your qada. Your qada is you've already lost the Dhuhr prayer. And to make up a prayer at the risk of losing a second prayer in its current time simply doesn't make sense. And so when you would miss your current prayer, if you had to observe this order, then the order ceases to be. The second excuse is the number of prayers is 6 or more. Okay? So once you have 6 make-up prayers in your obligation, right? Once you've missed 6 or more prayers, then this principle of tartib or order ceases to be. It ceases to apply to you. Why? The Hanafis basically, again, it was a very, okay, we acknowledge that observing this tartib is considered obligatory. But if someone has 100 make-up, how is he going to keep track of the order? It's very difficult. And so the Hanafi said that whenever there is an excessive amount of missed prayers, then the order ceases to be because it is difficult to maintain it. And they stipulated the number of determining what is excessive as prayers that exceed more than 1 day's worth of prayers. So namely 6 or more prayers. And the final excuse is forgetfulness. Forgetfulness, meaning that you slept, the Dhuhr time came in, you took a nap, you slept through it, Asr time came in, you woke up, you prayed Asr, and you're like, oh, wait a second, I forgot I didn't pray Dhuhr. This is a genuine act of forgetfulness, and in this case, your Asr will be considered valid, and you simply pray Dhuhr, and you do not have to worry about observing order again. So in this case, you prayed Asr, then you remembered you have to pray Dhuhr, then you pray Dhuhr, and that's it. You don't have to, in normal cases, what you would have to do is you would have to pray Dhuhr again, and then you would have to pray Asr again, because your Asr would be considered invalid because you do not observe order. But forgetfulness, the Prophet ﷺ said, what did he say? That nisyan is something that my ummah is overlooked for. And so forgetfulness is a human condition, and so people are not penalized over this particular condition, because there are genuine instances where an individual can just forget that he had a makeup prayer to perform. So these are the three excuses. So that's the section on missed prayers. Now, finally, we have this section on disliked times. Right, the disliked times of prayer. This is an interesting section in the book. Imam al-Quduri begins by saying, ولا تجوز الصلاة عند طلوع الشمس ولا عند قيامها في الظهيرة ولا عند غروبها ولا يصلي على جنازة ولا يسجد للتلاوة إلا عصر يومه عند غروب الشمس. Prayer is not permitted when, basically 3 times, when the sun is rising, when the sun is at its meridian during midday, meaning its highest point in the sky, and when the sun is setting. And nor is the funeral prayer or the prostration or recital allowed at these times. The only thing that is allowed, what's the exception? The current Asr prayer when the sun is setting. Okay? So when it comes to the disliked times, there are some times that are disliked because there is something inherent in that time that the Sharia has deemed disliked. The time itself is disliked. There are other disliked prayers that do not actually have anything to do with anything intrinsic to the time, but performing particular prayers within that time is disliked due to some external secondary considerations. And so we'll be taking both of these in this section. And so these 3 times are of the first category, right? They are disliked because of something related to the time itself. And so the Prophet ﷺ, there are numerous reports from the Prophet where he disliked prayers and he forbade prayers at these 3 times. So in Sahih of Imam Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ, one of the companions says that there were 3 times, right? 3 ساعات كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ينهانا أن نصلي فيهن أو أن نقبر فيهن موتانا. Right? There were 3 times during the day in which the Prophet forbade us from praying within them or from burying our deceased in them. And burying our deceased over here is taken as a reference to the funeral prayer. And then these 3 times are the ones that we mentioned, right? When the sun is rising until it has fully risen, when the sun is at its meridian or its high point in the sky during midday until it finally moves away from that position, and when the sun sort of begins to set until it sets completely. So these are the 3 times. And these 3 times were commonly associated with polytheistic activity, worship of the sun, and so on and so forth. And so that is why in that polytheistic context, and in affirming the message of Tawheed, and in stepping away from any tashabbuh or imitation of the polytheists, these 3 times were strictly forbidden in terms of the performance of prayer in them. And so there's something intrinsic within the time itself that renders it disliked, right? Now over here, we can also again look at it from a very rational and usuli perspective. Okay? A very rational and usuli perspective. So how did the Hanafis understand this from a rational perspective? The topic governing principle over here is that prayer must be performed as it was obligated. And we've taken this idea repeatedly in past lessons. Ada kamil and ada naqis. Right? And so the basis is that the prayer must be performed as it was obligated. Right? And it is recommended to perform prayer in the way it was recommended as a current performance. Which is why you give the adhan for missed prayers, you give the iqamah for missed prayers, and so on and so forth. We've taken many of these principles before. And so each of these 3 times that we've taken is a deficient time. The Prophet ﷺ associated with prohibition of praying, So these 3 times have a specific deficiency in them. Okay? And so what happens, the usuli argument that the Hanafis make is that when a prayer time enters, right? Let's say the time for Fajr enters. Now you have a lengthy amount of time to actually perform Fajr. You might have 2 hours, 3 hours to actually perform Fajr. So when the time enters, the wujub is established. It becomes obligatory upon you to perform the prayer. But this obligation is very expansive, right? Because it is not an immediate obligation. It is not an obligation that, oh, the time has come in, now you must start praying. Why? Because you have this, these 3 hours or so, 2.5, 3 hours to perform the prayer. And so it's an expansive wujub, okay, and not one that is immediate. But what the usuli say is, when does the prayer become specifically obligatory upon you to perform in an immediate manner? There are 2 scenarios that they identify. One is when the time becomes so constricted that you only have time left to perform a wudu and complete the prayer. Right? The time becomes so constricted that the time remaining, all you can do in that time is perform wudu and complete your prayer. When the time becomes restricted or constricted to that extent, then it becomes immediately obligatory upon you to begin praying now. The other moment in which the obligation becomes immediate upon you is when you actually initiate the prayer, right? So if Fajr time enters, 2 minutes after Fajr time, you say Allahu Akbar. The moment you say Allahu Akbar, the prayer you've obligated the prayer upon yourself now in an immediate fashion because you've initiated it. Okay? And so that becomes what they identify as the sabab for the immediate wujub of your prayer. Right? So over here, if we see this little diagram, you have the entry of a prayer time. Over here it's Fajr time. You start, somewhere in the middle. You finish maybe 10 minutes later. And then sunrise is like half an hour later over here. Okay? You perform the prayer within its time. Right? You perform the prayer within its time. So that's all well and good. Now, so this was scenario 1. Right? This was scenario 1 that we just took. And so let's read the description of the scenario. When the prayer time enters, the obligation to pray is expansive and not immediate. But when one says the tahrima, it is that specific moment that becomes the cause for praying, now becoming an immediate obligation upon one. Okay, you say Allahu Akbar. Before, the obligation was expansive. You said Allahu Akbar. You actually decided to engage in the prayer, and in that way, that juz of the time, that specific moment of the time, is when the prayers become specifically obligatory upon you. Because now you've started it, now you have to complete it. Okay? So in this case, if you look at the start and finish times, you start and finish the Fajr time within the normal time for Fajr. And so both these periods or moments of time are considered kamil. Right? These are considered kamil or complete times because they do not fall into the disliked times. They are the normal times in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted you to perform this prayer. Right? So you finish in a kamil time. You start in a kamil time, you finish in a kamil time. Both are complete. Let's take scenario 2. You start in a kamil time. This is when you start this prayer, this is when it becomes obligatory upon you. Right? So the obligation now is by doing the tahrima in a complete time, your current prayer has taken on sort of a complete form. But now it is concluded over here, it is finished over here after sunrise. So you're finishing it at a deficient time. Right? You're finishing the Fajr prayer at a deficient time, and so you are not performing the prayer as it was obligated. Because it was obligated to complete or camel time that lacked any dislikedness, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed you to pray the prayer in without any deficiency. But you're ending the prayer in this moment which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited the prayer to be performed in, and which the Prophet ﷺ has said one should not perform prayer in. So the manner in which the prayer was obligated upon you, you are not completing the prayer in that same manner. And so there's a deficiency, and this effectively, according to the Hanafis, invalidates your fard prayer when the sun rises, right? Because part of the prayer you are performing in a deficient way by doing it during a time that is deemed extremely disliked and deficient, while having started it and obligated it upon yourself in a time that was considered a complete and kamil time. And similarly with scenario 3, over here now, you miss Fajr prayer entirely. But you miss Fajr prayer entirely. You start after sunrise and you finish while the sun is rising. So it's a makeup, but during this disliked time. Over here, what happens? The prayer has become, how has it become obligatory upon you now? With the entry of the time, it was an expansive obligation. When you became close to sunrise and the time became restricted to an extent where all you can do now is perform Fajr, it becomes specifically obligatory upon you. Then the sun rises, the Fajr time is out, now it's a qada on you. Right? Now it's a qada on you, a makeup. How do you have to perform the makeup? The prayer must be performed as it was obligated. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated for you in that kamil time. This extent over here, from the entry point till the sunrise, this is the time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you to perform the obligatory prayer in. Right? Which is a time free of dislikedness. Now you are performing that prayer as a makeup in a deficient time. You are not performing it as it was obligated upon you. You are not performing in a deficient manner, and this is why your prayer is considered over here invalid. Right? Your Fajr prayer over here would be considered invalid. So these are three rulings, and I return to this idea of prayer times either being characterized by a kamal, a perfection, or a completeness to them, or prayer times being, or certain times being described as deficient with a naqs, because there has been a specific prohibition associated with the obligated prayer upon us in a specific manner within specific times. And those times are the kamil times for those prayers. Right? And prayer must be performed as it was obligated. And so when you're performing prayer in a manner where you are initiating it in a kamil time but concluding it in a deficient time, you are contravening that, and contravening the manner in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated that prayer upon you, considered valid when it suffers from this deficiency by performing it either completely or partially within these disliked times. Not considered valid. It is not considered valid to perform an obligatory prayer in these three times. As for the prostration of recital and the funeral prayer, prostration of recital, if the prostration of recital is basically when you read a Quranic verse where it is such a Quranic verse where it becomes obligatory upon you to do sajda, or a verse to which this ruling of the sajda is associated. So when it comes to the prostration of recital, if the verse that obligates you to prostrate is recited before the disliked times, then it is makruh tahriman, prohibitively disliked and sinful, to prostrate for it in the disliked times. Why? Because the prostration has been obligated upon you. You hear this verse or you recite this verse in a non-disliked time, in a time that is complete. When you hear it, sajda is becoming obligatory upon you when? In a kamil time. You are performing the sajda and trying to fulfill this. But if the verse was recited in the disliked time itself, it is only slightly disliked to prostrate for it in that time. Why? It has been established within a deficient time. And so if you are to perform it in that deficient time, right, you're performing it as it was obligated upon you originally. Fajr becomes a qada at its disliked time. But for the prostration of recital, you can think of a scenario where the sun is now, someone's reading the Quran, and you hear the prostration of you hear a verse of to which this ruling of prostration is associated. Right, that can happen. It's perfectly plausible. So when you hear it within that time, while the sun is rising, can you prostrate for it? Can you not prostrate for it? The ulama say it's permissible for you to prostrate for it. It's better for you to wait until the disliked time has passed. But if you prostrate for it within the disliked time, there's only a slight dislikedness in it. But otherwise, it is fine because it was obligated upon you in that deficient time itself. And the same detail applies for the funeral prayer. For the funeral prayer, there's actually more khilaf on it. In the funeral prayer, the ulama mentioned the funeral prayer effectively becomes specifically obligatory when the body is brought out to be prayed upon. So if the body is brought out before the disliked time, then it is prohibitively disliked to perform the funeral prayer within the disliked time. But disliked time, then it is only prostrate to perform this prayer in the disliked time. Again, this idea of, does it begin in a kamil time and end in a naqis time? Was it obligated? Was the obligation originally affirmed in a complete time, and now it is being performed in a deficient time? This is basically what the whole idea returns back to. With the funeral prayer, the difference of opinion, of course, we won't get into it right now, but there is some difference on whether it is even disliked to perform it within a disliked time when the body is brought out within that time itself. Some ulama said actually it's not disliked at all. It's considered permissible because the basis when it comes to the funeral prayer and funerary rites is that they are done in a manner, you almost do them in haste. In haste in the sense that you quicken these rituals because you want to bury the body and you want to complete all the funeral rituals as quickly as you can, and this is an explicit command from the Prophet ﷺ as well. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions that ويكره أن يتنفل بعد صلاة الفجر حتى تطلع الشمس. It is disliked to pray the supererogatory prayers after Fajr until the rising of the sun. This has nothing to do with the time itself. No. These issues that we're getting into now, they have nothing to do with an intrinsic dislikedness in the time itself, but rather due to other considerations. Over here, it's because there's an explicit hadith from the Prophet in Bukhari and Muslim that the Prophet said, لا صلاة بعد الصبح حتى تطلع الشمس ولا صلاة بعد العصر حتى تغيب الشمس. There is no prayer after the morning prayer until the sun rises, and no prayer after Asr until the sun sets. And the ulama pretty generally understood this as referring only to the Nawafil prayers, right? Not to the Fard prayers, because the Prophet ﷺ, what he said about the Fard was, he said when you, and in this specific case it will be, of course, makeups and stuff. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you forget a prayer or if you sleep through it, then pray it when you remember, and that will be its time. Pray it whenever you remember it, and that moment when you remember it, that will be the time for that prayer. And so there's no specific text stating that it is not permitted to make up prayers during this time or during any other time except the 3 times that we have previously identified. And that is why the vast majority of ulama understood this particular hadith as a reference to the Nawafil prayers, as a reference to the supererogatory prayers. And so the 2 times for the supererogatory prayers are 1, after Fajr until the rising of the sun, and then we have بعد صلاة العصر حتى تغرب الشمس, and it is disliked to perform supererogatory prayers after Asr until the sun sets. So these are the 2 mentioned in the prophetic hadith. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions ولا بأس بأن يصلي في هذين الوقتين الفوائد ويسجد للطلاوة ويصلي على الجنازة ولا يصلي ركعتي الطواف. There's no harm in praying in these 2 times, make-up prayers, performing the prostration and recital and the funeral prayer, but one does not perform the 2 cycles for tawaf. This is a bit of a complex discussion, but essentially yeah, my daughter's screaming. Okay, so essentially unlike the obligatory prayers, the 2 cycles unlike obligatory prayers or missed prayers, the 2 cycles for tawaf are seen as supererogatory. And this is a really interesting idea that the Hanafis have, that there are specific rituals that are originally considered nafal, supererogatory, that only become wajib due to something external. So the 2 cycles of tawaf only become wajib on an individual because of his act of performing tawaf. So when the individual performs tawaf of his own volition, of his own action, then the 2 cycles for tawaf become necessary on him to perform. And so when the Hanafis looked at this hadith, they tried to identify, they said, okay, the Prophet is prohibiting Nawafil prayers during these times. So let's look at the different types of prayers we have. We have obligatory prayers and we have supererogatory prayers. So we have your original and normal Nawafil prayers, right? Just a normal 2 rak'ahs of a nafil prayer. I intend 2 rak'ahs for nafil. Right? This is a normal prayer. For obligatory prayers, we have 2 types. We have 1 over here on the left, وجوبه لا يقف على فعله أي على فعل العبد, that its wujub does not rest on the action of the slave himself, meaning the obligation is something affirmed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala independent of any specific action the servant engages in. There's nothing the servant does that makes that prayer obligatory upon him. Rather, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that has made that prayer obligatory upon him. What do we mean by this? Fajr being obligatory on us has nothing to do with our own action. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, this time comes in, you have to pray. Make-up prayers have nothing to do with our own action. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when you miss prayer, or the Prophet said when you miss prayer, you repeat it when you remember it. Okay? So the wujub of these obligatory prayers, like Fajr, like make-ups, etc., their wujub does not rest upon the action of the slave. But then there are other prayers, تعلق وجوبه بفعل العبد, right? That their wujub actually rests upon the servant or the slave doing something that renders that prayer obligatory upon him. So a vow. I vow to Allah to perform X Nawafil prayers if Y happens. Those Nawafil prayers were not originally obligatory upon me. But I have engaged in an action, a vow, that has rendered them obligatory upon me. In and of themselves, those prayers, what are they? They are nawafil when it comes to what they inherently and originally represent. And the same is the case with the prayer of tawaf, or the prayer that you perform, the 2 cycles you perform after performing the tawaf. They only become obligatory upon you or wajib upon you because you have decided, okay, I want to do tawaf. So you do tawaf of the Kaaba, and then these 2 prayers become obligatory upon you. They become obligatory upon you because of your own individual action. Because the general rule is that tawaf should be followed by 2 cycles of prayer. Okay? So over here, the wujub of these 2 cycles, originally praying 2 cycles is just, it's considered nafil. The salah aslan is considered, apart from the obligatory prayers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stipulated, all other prayers as a default are considered nawafil prayers. But over here, you've engaged willingly in an act that has now made it obligatory upon you or wajib upon you to perform these 2 cycles, similar to what you have done with a vow. And so this is the second category of obligatory. Now, the interesting question over here, when the Hanafis were looking at this hadith, they were like, this particular category, should we assign it to the obligatory category, or should we assign it to the nawafil category? Because originally, these prayers are nawafil. Right? Originally, this category, تعلق وجوبه بفعل العبد, this category is originally, it's a nawafil prayer. It only becomes wajib upon an individual because of his own action. So do we treat this as an obligatory prayer for the purposes of this hadith, or do we treat it as something that is في نفسها نفل, right? And mulhaq bin nawafil, as something that is in and of itself a nafil prayer, and something that is attached to the nawafil prayer. And so the Hanafis treated it like this when it came to this specific hadith. So they said that when the hadith specifies or states that do not pray in these 2 times, do not pray any nawafil in these 2 times, then this means prayers that were originally and continue to remain normal nawafil prayers, like a normal intention that you just, after Asr, you might get up and say, oh, I intend to pray 2 cycles of nafil. That's a normal nafil prayer. Or if it is something that was originally a nafil, but becomes wajib upon you because of your own action. Why? Because the original state of these prayers was a supererogatory status. And so this is how the Hanafis, this is why when it came to the 2 cycles of tawaf, they said that it should not be prayed during these times as well, because these two cycles of prayer are originally nafil in nature, and they only become obligatory by the act of the slave or the servant. And so they are not that pristine type of wujub or fard that has been obligated upon us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any connection to our own action. There's no connection of our own action in making that prayer obligatory. So they restricted that they only allowed this category of prayers over here, whereas they understood the prohibition from the Prophet is applying to the supererogatory in both its forms, right? But you can see that it can go both ways. It can either be attached to the obligatory or attached to the nafil, but the Hanafis chose to attach it to the nawafil prayer for the sake of this hadith. And then we have this 2 more slides left. Is ويكره أن يتنفل بعد طلوع الفجر بأكثر من ركعتي سنة الفجر. It is disliked to perform any nafil prayer after the onset of dawn, save the 2 sunnah of fajr. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ is not, this was not his practice. Right? Despite the Prophet being very eager to pray and being the individual who was most in worship of his Lord, his practice was not to perform more than 2 cycles of Fajr, 2 Sunan of Fajr before the Fajr prayer, right? So the Hanafi said that this indicates that there are no other Sunan in this specific time that are considered recommended for an individual. And then finally we have وَلَا يَتَنَفَّلُ قَبْلَ الْمَغْرِبِ. One does not perform any supererogatory prayers before Maghrib. And again, this has nothing to do with the time. It's not that there's some dislikiness in the time itself, right? Rather, what this means is, and قبل المغرب over here means before the Maghrib prayer, and after the sun has set, right? After the sun has set, of course, and Maghrib has entered. And this has to do with the idea of the Prophet ﷺ discouraged the delaying of Maghrib, and his practice was to pray Maghrib as close to the entry of the time as possible. And so by praying supererogatory prayers, this can lead to a delay in the Maghrib prayer, and so it is considered somewhat disliked to perform this prayer. So that is the disliked times, and inshallah we'll end with that. One of the interesting things over here to note is, the Hanafi fuqaha are actually quite interestingly forgiving of lay people who pray during these times, lay people who even pray during the disliked times, the 3 disliked times that we took. And there are many Hanafi ulama who mentioned that when the awam engage in some of these activities, the first thing is, of course, on some of these points there's genuine khilaf between the schools, right? And so the Hanafis took that into account, and they took into account the fact that, well, I mean, the worst thing we can say is that they're praying at a time in which we don't believe they should be praying. And so the Hanafi ulama were actually quite clear that people should not tell the awam, when you see someone praying during one of these times or during the 3 disliked times, don't tell them, oh, don't pray. Don't stop them. Don't tell them that, oh, in our madhab it's this or that. Rather, let them pray. Why? Because, at least they're praying. It's better for them to pray during these times than to just leave prayer altogether. And especially when there is difference of opinion between the various madhab on some of these disliked times, there's no need to discourage people who are performing prayers during these times, especially if you fear that it will lead to them just simply saying, okay, I don't feel like praying then. I'm busy, I have to go to work. This was the only time I could find to pray, so I was just doing it. But if you're saying I can't do it, then I'll try to do it later, or something like that. So the Hanafis are very conscious of this, and they mention this in several of their texts. So inshallah, with that point, we will end this session. Let me see if there are any questions from the... Okay, I don't see any questions. So inshallah, we'll end with that. Barakallahu feekum to everyone for coming, and I will see you all on Friday. And I think that we'll continue with a discussion on the Nawafil prayers, the forgetfulness prostration, and the prostration of recital. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله صحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.